Welcome to Inclusive Teaching, Strategies for Engaging All Students. In this video, I'll outline some of the theory and evidence behind inclusive teaching. Then I'll share an inventory designed to help you consider inclusive teaching strategies in key areas such as presenting content and interacting with students. Finally, I'll offer some thoughts about situating inclusive teaching within the university community and the wider world. While our teaching often focuses on the content and skills we want students to walk away with and how to convey them successfully, inclusive teaching highlights the importance of focusing on your students as people. Some elements of your teaching will help students succeed because they are informed by deep knowledge of how a field or discipline works and how to succeed in it, because they recognize how motivation works, or because they model how to break down a topic or process to make it intelligible, or how to scaffold an assessment so that it reinforces your learning goals. And some elements of your teaching will help students succeed because they recognize that students have different backgrounds, needs, and circumstances that shape their learning. But even if you center your students and invite them to express themselves fully, you sometimes miss stuff because students don't or can't always open up about what they need. So you have to have systems that support them. Developing these systems is partially dependent on instructors, but it's also structural. Universities and disciplines have to do their part to be welcoming financially, socially, and intellectually to a broad range of students, and to ensure a critical mass of many different forms of identity. So while we're focusing on what we can do in our courses, there's a broader form of advocacy to tap into here. We'll talk more about that at the end of this video. Some key elements of inclusive teaching. While it's important to recognize and account for difference, especially in contexts where there isn't a critical mass of students from underrepresented groups, it's important not to tokenize individuals by making them the representatives of an entire group. From an activity and assignment design perspective, the universal design for learning theory can be especially helpful here. Universal design for learning is an approach that began in K-12 schools as a way of dealing with students' individual and specialized needs, and it's widely applicable to higher ed as well. Its core idea is that not every activity will resonate with every student, but creating multiple means of engagement will help you pull in everyone eventually. If you offer enough pathways into the knowledge or skills you want students to demonstrate, you'll have a better chance of reaching everyone overall. This can be especially true when you're giving instructions. You might consider posting information about how to use a tool or where to access an assignment in text on Blackboard, then doing a demo in a video chat session, then making yourself available for questions and building in time to answer them. I also want to mention the notion of microaggressions. Microaggressions are comments or actions by well-intentioned individuals who are completely unaware that they have engaged in a demeaning, offensive, or discriminatory manner. The discourse around microaggressions often talks about them in a racial context, but they exist in many other contexts as well, like gender and disability. An example that comes up in a reproductive health context, for example, is saying pregnant women instead of pregnant people. Not everyone who's able to get pregnant is a woman. An important thing to note about microaggressions is, as Robert L. Rees points out, that the micro prefix isn't meant to say that these are slight acts. Instead, it attempts to capture that they happen at a micro level between individuals as opposed to at the macro level of institutions or social structures. But, as Daryl Dwing-Sue, a psychologist who has written extensively about microaggressions, explains, they aren't fully individual acts. They're linked to worldviews and ideas of superiority and inferiority. These small acts add up, and the repeated denial of individuals they produce can be as or more harmful than overtly aggressive or bigoted acts. But microaggressions can be addressed by micro-interventions, small actions that can go a long way towards making students feel comfortable. The inclusive teaching inventory that I'll introduce momentarily is essentially a catalog of these micro-interventions. This visual, which you may have seen before, can be helpful. As you can see here, the idea behind equality is to provide the same opportunities for everyone, but that doesn't take into account historical and contemporary forms of discrimination that mean that not everyone exists on a level playing field. Equity recognizes that different students may require different types or levels of support to redress disparities that they came in with. Many of the individual interventions you make will fall under the equity category, as you give students with different needs the tools to succeed, whether it's multiple ways into an assignment or concept or flexibility. As you do your individual work, think about the larger context in which it operates and how you can participate and support that work. It's important to go beyond inclusion to think in actively anti-racist ways that focus on equity and justice, not just access, and that attempt to redress issues as opposed to simply inviting everyone in. I'll circle back to that idea more fully in a couple minutes. For now, though, I want to talk a little about the inclusive teaching inventory. This tool has several strategies in 4 key areas: content, instructional practices, instructor-student interactions, and student-student interactions. It includes strategies for hybrid or online courses, but many of its practices are universal across modalities and can be easily adapted to any situation. This isn't a scorecard. Courses can be inclusive and student-centered even without doing most of what's listed here, or they can include many of these elements and still alienate students. Instead, this is meant to be an opportunity for reflection. To that end, you'll see some annotation suggestions to mark what you do already, what you'd like to try, where you might need additional information or support, and also what you don't think would work based on your situational factors. Many of these strategies can be implemented in grading or teaching contexts. Some can't, and we recognize that in your roles, you don't always have the authority to choose readings or set policies or the opportunity to conduct lessons. Nevertheless, familiarizing yourself with this inventory can help you reflect on your own learning experiences and advocate for inclusive teaching whenever possible. As you spend time with the inventory, think about what you're already doing and what you might like to try. So far, we've been talking in terms of strategies, and I like talking in these terms because it suggests immediate changes. There are things you can do now, and there's some things that you can think through. But I also want to talk about frameworks and ask the question of whether we need to shift the entire lens through which we've been thinking. So far, we've discussed inclusion as a goal, but not the only goal, and treated it as a starting point, but not a solution. I also want to create a space for the viewpoint that inclusion can stifle other efforts. Dr. D.L. Stewart articulates this provocatively and concisely in a piece in Inside Higher Education. They argue that diversity and inclusion rhetoric often gets substituted for transformative efforts to promote equality and justice. Here's some examples of what this can look like. There are different questions asked depending on the perspective that we're approaching this issue from. And here's an additional example. I bring up these examples not because I want to get into semantics of what words we use to describe our efforts, but to make sure that we are thinking big. As Angela Davis puts it, without transforming the context, diversity and inclusion is not going to move us in a more progressive direction. People can be, quote, included within an institution that remains as racist and patriarchal as it was before we were included, end quote. As you complete this module, we hope you will feel empowered to create a positive, welcoming environment in your teaching while working to make your teaching environment more equitable and just.